We need to live into those transitions and leverage them as opposed to avoiding them as thinking that they're awkward or toxic, and we're kind of embarrassed to be in transition, because more and more we're having more and more life transitions and work transitions with the nature of our economy and our society.
Hello and welcome back, or welcome to The Messy Middle, a podcast designed for people tired of chasing external methods to resolve our internal messiness. I'm your host, Andrew Horsfield. The purpose of this podcast is to have conversations with leaders and experts in their field who share personal and practical strategies that you can implement to advance your career, company, and life. You can find out more or listen to previous episodes at andrewhorsfield.com/podcast. I'm really excited to be sharing this conversation with Gregg Vanourek with you. Gregg is an expert who's authored 3 books, one of which was a winner at the International Book Awards. He also runs his own leadership and personal development company and teaches leadership at the Stockholm Business School. But prior to deciding to help others lead, Gregg was also a leader himself, a senior executive at a startup that scaled up and has now become a market leader with over $1 billion in sales. And what I found both impressive and compelling about Gregg is he's one of these rare experts who practices what he preaches. In this conversation, Gregg shares why we should suspend the drift and live life by design, some common traps we fall into that hinder our life's happiness, the importance of conducting regular life audits, how we can transform failures into life lessons, and a whole lot more. This conversation is full of insights and wisdom that you'll want to write down, reflect upon, and remember later on. So grab a notebook and pen and enjoy this amazing conversation with Gregg Vanourek. Gregg, welcome to The Messy Middle. It's awesome to have you on, and people don't need to know, but it's taken a little while for us to get there, mostly because of my undoing and juggling around. So it's a pleasure to be talking with you and finally getting this opportunity.
Likewise, Andrew, there's power in persistence. So here we are. Glad to be with you.
Awesome. So I want to jump straight in because I think there's a lot for us to cover with your work in particular, and it certainly aligns to a lot of what The Messy Middle is about as a podcast. So, you know, your work connects leadership, life design, and personal development. I'd love to start by you sharing how these 3 areas connect and what made you focus on that combination.
Yeah, I guess I'm a believer that it's important to lead yourself well first before you can presume to lead others, much less lead them effectively. And if you want to do advanced leadership or lead change or innovate or adapt to all the dynamic challenges, it really starts with that foundation. So I think about my work as leading self, leading others, and leading change, but with a focus on leading self first, because a lot of people, I think, skip over that. They take it for granted, and it gets them into trouble. And for me, it goes back to when I was in university. I had a philosophy professor who asked us to ask the big questions in life of kind of, why are you here? What do you want to do with your days on the planet? You know, what are you going to do about the problem of evil in the world? What do you want to accomplish? And then I took another course the next year called Theories of the Good Life, which was a philosophy religion course where we studied what people have said about what it means to lead a good life over the ages. Ancient Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy, modern existential poets, people in the process of dying or reflecting back on their life. And of course, we got the opportunity to answer, what do we think it means to live a good life for us, because we're all different. So that's how I got started into this whole racket. And those seeds that were planted many years ago continue to be harvested, and I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, and it's a lovely place to start, isn't it, with self? Because I think, as you mentioned, you can get into trouble by not knowing some of those triggers that can hinder, but we also don't appreciate or deeply appreciate some of the strength and experience that we have, do we? And it allows for that opportunity as well for people.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's important for us to mine our story. We as human beings are meaning makers and meaning seekers. And there's a lot of chaos in the world, there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion, but you can also make meaning of what's happening. But it's important also to make meaning of what you've done and how you've showed up in life, what's happened to you, how you've reacted to it. And it's actually very, very powerful when you take time to do that, to mine your personal story and see some of the patterns and see where you've fallen down, see where you've done well, and then hopefully continue to evolve and grow and bring more value to your colleagues and to the world.
Yeah, I'd love to, because you talk about the concept of life design, where can you explain why you believe it's important and how this approach helps us live more meaningful, rich lives?
Yeah, I mean, I really focus these days on intentionally crafting your life and work, including your leadership. And I think, I've been in situations in my life where I haven't been doing that, and you run into a lot of trouble. And so I think it's important. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And if you don't design or craft your life intentionally, you can just be drifting through your life. Now, you could be productive, you can be active, but you literally can go years and even decades and kind of get to some point where you say, how did I get here? Is this where I wanted to go? Is this where I chose to go? Is this a good place for me? Right. And another thing that you can run into is you end up settling. If you don't intentionally craft your life, you end up with, well, my work's okay, and maybe I make a decent wage, and I have some, people who kind of have some status or whatnot, but I'm not thriving. I'm not on fire. I'm not firing on all cylinders, right? And then you can also end up conforming to what other people think you should do, your parents or your peers or society, whatever that means. And so you end up living someone else's life for maybe large swaths, if not your whole life. And then that leads to a lot of regret because, it's precious what we do with our work, what we do in our family, what we do in our community, in our fun. It's precious time. And so, I'm just a big believer in remembering that it's a gift and trying to be thoughtful. I mean, we got to engage. We can't be sitting around. I'm not talking about navel gazing and just abstractly just thinking. I like to bounce between reflection and action as a really important modality. But it's really important. And I think the world today works against us in terms of doing that well. So we have to fight for it a little bit.
Yeah, tell us more about that. How does the world work against us to live this? We know this intellectually, but practically we find it hard. So tell us a little bit about how the world's conspiring to make this difficult.
Well, if we pause to think about it, Andrew, it's really a remarkable time that we're in. It's incredible the amount of progress and development that's been made in recent decades and centuries, how privileged we are compared to 100, 200 years ago. I mean, it's just astonishing, right? But it's also very precarious. There's big, big challenges and dangers. And so in this world, we're hyper connected and we are often distracted. And there's, these devices and whatnot. These algorithms are brilliantly designed for a business model that's going to take us and capture us and just take us down rabbit holes or being kind of passively consuming, which sometimes we need to do, and sometimes it's fun. I'm not a Luddite, and I do that too. But you can end up, if you actually map the time, you end up, you know, spending huge quantities of time that have been deployed by others, right? And so, and then it puts you in a mental state where there's this low level anxiety and there's this kind of buzz. And often we actually do it to numb ourselves from pain or not to address the elephant in the room, the challenge. And so we're avoiding the issue or whatnot. So there's the context that we're in, I think, is really, really challenging. And then on top of that, many of the people probably in your community are high achievers. And I'm a big believer in hard work. I love to work hard. I love my work. And I've been an athlete. I've been in bands and I've done all sorts of different things in my career, which I love and I'm very proud of. But you can also get to a point where it becomes like an addiction, where it becomes too consuming. And I've been there. I was working for a startup that ended up being a scale up and ended up becoming unhealthy with all the travel and not sleeping well and all the stress. And not honoring the important relationships in my life and becoming empty. And people talk about burnout, but there's also a notion of kind of rust out where you really feel truly empty in life. And so it's not a good place to be. I think a lot of us face that. It's a big social problem. So yeah, there's a lot of these external influences that we've got to fight against.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you say that hard work's okay, because there's got to be some work that allows us to reflect, that allows us to see both what we're good at and how we double down on that, but also those areas that this keeps tripping me up. Life keeps trying to put this lesson in front of me because I haven't learnt it yet. And I like that you're saying that it's okay to do a bit of hard work, but we've got to be focused on the right hard work, I assume.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and add that. I think hard work for what would be the question. And so, again, I'm a big believer in hard work, but it can also become an ego trip of epic proportion if it's all about me and what I want and how I look and what I want to accumulate and what I want to drive so that I can show people or where I live or vacation, right? And that's another trap. It's not only another trap, Andrew. I think it's one of the mega traps. It's one of the traps beneath the other traps. And I would say fear is another one of those. And so hard work, I would say, can be for the good things in life that we can enjoy. We can have a pleasurable life and we can, travel and do the fun things, whatever it is for you, kayaking, hiking, spending time with your kiddos, but also, you know, adding value to people in ways big and small, your colleagues. If you're working hard, are you helping your colleagues? Are you being a good team member? Are you being a good follower or a good manager? And is there some value you're adding to the customers and to the community, right? And so we've got to avoid this trap of just needing status and admiration and achievement and success for our own purposes that aren't going to hold up well over time if we're overly focused on them. We've got to be sufficiently other focused as well and engaged in our families and our friendship circles and our communities. And by the way, if we work too hard, we tend to disconnect as well from our colleagues and our family and our friends. And that's one of the greatest sources of regret that people have.
Yeah. I was going to ask you before we talk about some of those traps, because that was one of the things that connected me into your work that I really, really love. But I wanted to ask you, are there common crossroads that you find when people meet that realization of, hang on, what's this all been service of? Is it retirement? Is it the change of a job? Is it the dissolving of a relationship? Are there common times where you find people reflecting on what the purpose of all this has been?
Yes, I would say that graduating from school or university is one of them, as you kind of go out into the world where everything's structured and organized for you. And all of a sudden you've got to say, who am I and what do I want to do with the 90,000 hours on average that we're going to spend working in our lives in advanced economies, right? So that's one of them. I would say some kind of early career. Often we'll hit inflection points where we start to question, do I want to stay in this career or do I want to make a change? If we get fired, if there's a external shock, whether it's a pandemic or these kinds of things. And then midlife, I think having children is another, getting married, and retirement, where a lot of people, their identity is so wrapped up in their work that they struggle with, like, who am I now? And I saw my dad struggle with that after a very successful, distinguished career in business and with all sorts of leadership roles. But the retirement transition was tough. So there's a wonderful book by Bruce Feiler called Life is in the Transitions. And so, Andrew, to your question, there's all these transitions that are out there. And I think we need to live into those transitions and leverage them as opposed to avoiding them as thinking that they're awkward or toxic. And we're kind of embarrassed to be in transition because more and more we're having more and more life transitions and work transitions with the nature of our economy and our society.
What's at stake for people if we're drifting too much rather than design? What's the cost? What's at stake for people to be living that life rather than one by design?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one thing that comes to mind is squandering the life that we've been given and the resources that we have, the opportunities and the privileges that come from our parents or from where we live. And then the other one would be regret. We end up doing all this stuff, and at some point, you're going to end up looking back, and the question will pop up: how does it all hold up? How did I do? Right? We're all going to face that at some point, unless we're just not reflective at all. And sometimes we do get divorced from that inner voice, and we're so busy in the world or whatnot. But there's a wonderful poem that I love by William Safford called Ask Me. And it goes something like, when the river is ice, ask me. Ask me mistakes I've made. And then he goes on to say, ask me whether what I've done is my life. And Parker Palmer writes about that in one of his books. And he says, to some people, that question will be nonsense. Nonsense. Ask me whether what I have done is my life. Of course, it's me living my life. But to other people, that question will be haunting because they haven't been living their life, or they've been living in ways that they're going to come to regret, and maybe not setting a good example for the people that they love and care about, their spouse or their children or their cherished colleagues and best friends.
Mm. And that probably leads us a little bit into the traps, because one of them is talking about sort of delaying our happiness for the future. The when, and you mentioned when we have the car or when we have the bigger house, so we'll be happy. Can you tell us about some of those traps? I know there's way too many that you have, and we'll certainly have some links to those from your website for people to look at, because they're really compelling and thought-provoking if you want to sit down with them. But can you share a couple that you think have resonated, or that might be worth people thinking about or reflecting on, that we can get caught in?
Absolutely. So one of the ones that you were just teeing up there, Andrew, is postponing our happiness and deferring our dreams. So you say, yes, there are things that I want to do in my life, really exciting things that pull me towards them. But you say, no, it's not the right time. I've got to buckle down, head down, I've got to execute. And that's fine. Again, hard work. And I'm a big believer too that sometimes you need to pay your dues and you need to prove yourself and prove your value and develop what is called career capital. But the problem is that too often we end up postponing and postponing and deferring such that the good stuff arrives so late. My God, we're like, whoa, I could have been doing this earlier in my 30s, in my 40s, or it never arrives. So that's one big trap. A lot of the traps actually I found through the traps test online that I have that people do, and through my interviews with people about the common traps of living. And by the way, I define these as what are the things that inhibit your happiness, your quality of life, and your fulfillment. And so these are the life traps. And then separately, I do work on leadership traps too, that inhibit your leadership effectiveness. But a lot of the life traps actually have a psychological dimension. And so another really common one, just amazingly common, is negative self-talk, where we are basically in a mental prison that we've put ourselves in. And we're so brutal to ourselves. It's been said often that we would never talk to our best friend that way or a valued colleague that way, but we're so judgmental and so harsh with ourselves. And it just goes on and on and on. And then related to that is the trap of self-doubt, where we might have all these talents and all these skills and strengths. We've accomplished a lot, but we focus on the negative for a lot of reasons. And related to that are limiting beliefs. And then another psychological one is the trap of overthinking, where we're just too much in our heads. And there's different flavors of this. One of the flavors is worrying too much about the future, and what's going to happen, and oh, I don't know if it's going to work out well or if I'll do a good job. And another flavor is rumination, where we've just got this script where we just can't stop thinking. It's just playing over and over. I can't believe what I said. And we're lying there at night and we can't fall asleep. We're just ruminating. And related to that is the trap of the monkey mind, where we can't focus and be present and serene, like the Stoics say. Our thoughts are just bouncing and we've got no control. And we just, again, it's this kind of low level anxiety. And it's just not a good state to be in, where we're centered and we're at our best. So those are some of the dozens of common traps that are out there.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great explanation for a big piece of work that you've refined really nicely, Greg. I'm asking this with my tongue firmly placed in my cheek, but that all sounds nice, and I'd love to live better. But I got kids, I got to get up. I've got a boss on my back. I'm part of the local community footy club that's asking 20 hours a week from me to help out there, and this is all great, but I just don't know how the hell to get all this done. Where do I start? How do I get myself out of this drift into something that even resembles design?
Yeah, and I get it. And some of this stuff can sound distant. It can sound utopian or abstract and philosophical. And again, I want to bring it back to the real world, because in the real world, you have to take responsibility for your life, full responsibility. And so, what I would challenge people is, yes, those things are true. And often it's hard. We're at chapters in our life. Maybe you've got young children, and you've got career, maybe you have two parents working, or you're taking care of an aging parent, or you've been laid off, and those things are true. But you still always have to take full responsibility for your life, your whole life, everything in it. And a big part of that is the mindset you bring to it. And so I think a lot of times those things can become excuses and rationalizations. And our minds are so good at rationalizing. Again, it goes back to postponing. Well, there's all these reasons why you're not doing that startup, or you're not asking to be on that project, or you're not doing that side hustle, or you're not investing in that boat so you can travel with your family, or you're not learning the guitar, or whatever it is. There's all these reasons. Sometimes they're good reasons, but my God, sometimes you just have to break through. And so one of the books that I wrote with a colleague is called Life Entrepreneurs, Ordinary People Creating Extraordinary Lives. And that book, which I wrote with Christopher Gergen, is about being a maverick in the art of living. It's about living with purpose and passion, and intentionally going after the life you want, and not just accepting the life that's been handed to you. So as part of that, there's adventure and there's risk. And so we use the metaphor of entrepreneurship. The French word entrepreneur ultimately means the acting person. It's the one who undertakes. They don't sit around excusing, blaming, rationalizing. They go after it. They take action, and if it doesn't work, they learn. They pivot. You go through the build, measure, learn feedback loop. Try something new. So it comes back to ourselves and just taking responsibility.
Yeah. Do you think we underestimate the small steps that can matter in making some of that change? We sort of feel ourselves in a stuckness, whatever that may be, life, work, career, relationship, even relationship with kids sometimes, because they can be demanding and ask a lot of us. Do you think sometimes we're looking to go from 0 to 100 in one step, rather than just take the first step and find that actually that's got me to a different place that's lightened up a little bit, and I can take another step, and then over time, we can take larger leaps as we go, and just discount that sort of small can scale quite significantly?
I do. I think that's a big mistake that can trip people up, which is this notion of, I need total clarity on the whole vision and the strategy and the tactics. And I have to go big. I have to know all the answers. And that can paralyze us. It can get us into a state of analysis paralysis, as they say. And so, one of the principles of life entrepreneurship we can learn from design thinking and from lean startup innovation methods is a bias for action, and action at the smallest possible scale. So Eric Ries would talk about minimum viable product. And so what can I do today where I can put something out there? I can build a prototype, or I can put together an offer, or I can talk to people. And so you really want to just scale it down and not, and again, get out of your head and be doing things. And doing things can mean a lot of things, including one of my favorite things is life design interviews or other forms of interviews where you're talking to people from a total place of curiosity and learning, and you're asking them what did they try and how did it work, and I think most people are happy to share. They're kind of honored to be asked, and then they actually end up wanting to help you, and so it might lead to an open door or a contact. But I think there's real wisdom in kind of scaling it down and having a bias towards action. The other principle from design thinking is don't do it alone. So it's this notion of radical collaboration. And so my colleague Richard Leiter says isolation is fatal. If you're trying to sit there and think through the perfect strategy or figure it all out yourself, ask for help, work with people, have a little sprint or an accountability partner. So a bias for action and radical collaboration are two principles that can really help get us unstuck and move us forward.
Nice one. I wanted to change tack slightly, and this podcast is called The Messy Middle. So I wanted to ask about a messy middle that you've been in recently, and what it was, how you navigated it, and what you learned from it.
Yeah, many messy middles. Life is messy. And it's one of the points we made in the Life Entrepreneurs book, that it's not a straight path. It's the path is winding. The path of the life entrepreneur is winding. So a big one for me would be my family and I picked up and moved to Sweden. And just when our daughters were 3 and 1. And I didn't have anything lined up in Sweden. My wife is Swedish, and so she has family and friends over here, but she didn't have a job lined up. But we had decided as a family that part of our aspirations of raising the family the way we wanted to do it was to honor both the American side of our family and the Swedish side. And so when I got there, it was very messy, and I was trying to learn the language and found that as an American, my style of networking, probably needed a lot of tweaks in Scandinavia, and I had a lot to learn. And the cultural gaps were much bigger than I thought. Because I'd only lived in London for 1 year previously when I was in grad school, and it's totally different from raising a family, when you're in your 30s. And so, back to that challenge of doing a lot of things, learning the language. I ended up doing a lot of teaching at master's level over there and finishing a book, but figuring out my identity. Who am I when I don't have a job, or when things aren't going smoothly? And back to the negative self-talk and the self-doubt, and how much I could be my own enemy, right? And how it could stress me out and cause me to not be the husband and the father that I wanted to be because it was too messy. And then to look back on that and say, Greg, why couldn't you be okay in that messy middle? Why couldn't you just have faith? You don't know when it's going to become more clear or whatnot, but you're still you, and you still have done some cool things, and you still have all these blessings in your life. And so, and then we moved back, and it was another process, another messy middle of coming back after 10 years, and things have changed dramatically. A pandemic hits, and it's messy again. And now the girls are teenagers, and they're tweens and stuff. And so you're back in the messy. And so, it's how do we stay calm and collected and bring our best self, even when things are chaotic around us and unclear?
And do you have a process for doing that, particularly that you would use to find that clarity and calm in in the moments you need it?
Yeah, what I've come to on that question, Andrew, is what I call safe harbor. We're all going to have storms in our lives. We're going through a market storm the last few days. We've been through a global pandemic. We've been through a financial crisis not long ago. And then there's the personal stuff, the career stuff, the health storms. And so for me, the safe harbor are some of the personal fundamentals. And so it's having clarity and self-awareness on things like what are my core values? What are my beliefs about what do I value most and how do I want to act and show up and treat other people? Getting clarity not only on those words, but the description of them and how they show up in my life, where they come from. And then what are my strengths? What am I good at? And what are my passions? What do I love to do and what do I get lost in? And then a harder one for many people is, what is my purpose? What do I feel is my reason for being? And if that's too abstract, maybe it's just what feels purposeful and meaningful and what gives you fulfillment. And so those can be a safe harbor. Having clarity and kind of coming back home to those gives me strength. It gives me confidence. I start trusting myself again. And then also coming back to what I did many years ago, which is writing down a vision of the good life. So a lot of companies have a vision statement. Sometimes it's lame and it's just corporate speak, or it's jargon and it's just on a website somewhere. But if they're serious about it, they actually talk about it and they use about it. They use it, to make decisions and to determine their strategy and their goals and their org structure and the people that they bring in, and they have accountability and feedback mechanisms. So, why not have a vision for your life and write down, where do you want to go? What horizon do you want to sail toward? And to me, if you do that well, it's just very powerful, and it becomes this compelling thing of like, yeah, that's the way I want to live. And then you get away from it, and it's like, oh, I got to read that again. I come back to it. So it's
Mm.
purpose, it's values, strengths, passions, and vision are some of the things for me that are those safe harbor elements.
Yeah, I really like that, Greg. And I think if people are struggling with the purpose, one of the things I would often recommend is just looking at, well, what's the purpose of, that we talked about the big life transitions of university or changing job, but there's also those little transitions of one meeting to another meeting, or, you and I talking now versus what you'll do after this and I'll do after this. And there's also these micro transitions where we can just say, what do I want to get out of this conversation, for example? What do I want to get out of being now an interviewer? I know it's the end of your day, it's at the start of our day here, but how do you transition from an expert and someone being interviewed into a parent or a husband as you walk through the door into the house? And so there's those little micro transitions that people can, if that concept of purpose is too big, to just look at, what do I want to get out of this experience? Who do I want to be as I walk through this door? And I think that can just bring it into a reality that helps people not suffer from that big, well, what's my legacy or life purpose, or what are they going to name the hospital wing after me for?
Yeah, I love that. My colleague Richard Leiter, who's a purpose author and guru, he talks about big P purpose versus little p purpose. And the big P is, do I want to be involved in sustainability or climate or trafficking? And the little p is kind of, what can I do today or in the next
Mm.
meeting to help someone or make somebody's life better? And so I love what you said about kind of recentering. And I actually think that one of the, back to what we talked about earlier of the contextual challenges of distraction and change and devices, is we're not present enough in our life. And so for me personally, Andrew, having some centering habits and routines, where it's how I start my morning with my cup of tea and reading and prayer and sometimes meditation and doing what I do, before bed, where I think back on the day and taking breaks and going for walks during the day to get outside more. Those little things can just center me more, help me be more present, and to your point, more purposeful.
Yeah, I've done the same. It's funny. I was going through a messy middle, and it was going back to that concept of bookending. Starting the day, finishing the day with just some reflection. And I had done it and found it useful, but then it started to lose its purpose. So I flipped to something else, and then I thought, no, I want to go back and try that again. And it's been really helpful to just start the day with some intentionality around, what's this day got ahead of it for me, and how do I want to show up to that as a person? And then the end of the day, how did I, and what was the benefit of doing that, or where could I do that differently again? And I'm sharing that with people just to say that sometimes you might have tried something, but it might be worth going back to, rather than just throwing it in the bin saying, well, that didn't work for me. Keep trying, keep finding a way.
I agree. I second the motion, Andrew, because to me, it's been a game changer because so many people, they wake up, they grab their device, and they just go into their feed. And their feed is either social media and it's comparison and, oh my God, the Instagram life, or it's the outrage of the news and can you believe this? And it just sets you up. And then by the way, you just burned 22 minutes and it just now you're
Hmm.
frazzled and you're late and you're stressed versus yeah, no. I'm gonna grab my device after I've started my day well, and so it just makes a big difference. And I think you're right. It is hard, and you can kind of fall off the horse, but just get back to it and break it down into smaller elements, and then just build on it. And you build those atomic habits like James Clear talks about, and eventually you kind of live into them.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really nice point. Thank you, Greg. In your TEDx talk, you talk about regular life audits, and I sort of had three questions with this that I wanted to ask in two parts. The first being, what does a life audit look like in practice, and are there specific things that you recommend that we should explore? And then I want to do the reflection question after that. So I suppose the two questions: how do we do it? What should we look for in that practice? And maybe what is it? Because people may not know what that means.
Yeah, so it can be. I like to allow people to use their creativity and figure out what works for them. So for me, I do an annual life review and a quarterly review as well. So I just finished one not long ago, and I've iterated on that. I've played around with it. I like to actually start at the top with kind of personal, go into my calendar for the quarter and say, what have I done? Date nights with my wife, fun things with my parents and my friends, or trips and whatnot. And then I look at professionally, what are the positive things, the accomplishments, how are my metrics looking? So I've got some data. And then also look at where did I not do the things that I wanted to do with a little reflection and analysis. And what does that mean for me going forward? And then I also end it with gratitudes. And I think that's really important. Every night before I go to sleep, I think of three things that I'm grateful for from the day. Just, family stuff or a fun thing, funny thing. And with the quarterly and annual life review, it's kind of what are the things that I'm just grateful for, where I'm just privileged, or and so that's just something that for me is just really helpful. Otherwise, time can fly, and you kind of miss out on a lot of things, and it's just helps keep you present.
I do a similar practice, and I wondered, so yours is quite a strategic looking back with some data and a process that you follow to capture both metrics and what's meaningful for you, as opposed to just a meandering sort of day or two off where you just capture what comes to mind. It's more of a structured process for you.
Yeah, it's a structured process, but it also includes just the stuff that I did. And I find that that's actually important. So just actually documenting, like I went to see some nice movies, or I went to see a live music show or whatnot, because otherwise it's so easy to forget. You're like, oh wow, I did some really fun things and interesting things. So there's structure, but there's also just kind of some fun in there.
What do you recommend people do with what emerges? So you mentioned there's some really good things that you see and want to recognize, and there's things you might want to recalibrate. How do you recommend people sort of use that data to go into the next quarter or the next year, depending on what sort of review they're doing?
Yeah. So I guess, I would really, if I'm working with somebody, I would want to know what are the kinds of things that work for them. But for me, I really like to calendarize things. And so some of the big takeaways: is there a daily reminder or two that I'm literally going to put into my smartphone so it pops up and asks this kind of probing question? Or is there a new flow that I want to do to reflect couple of really big priorities, of big projects that I'm juggling, and where I want to put like a theme day on a Monday and a different theme on a Wednesday, something like that. So for me, calendarizing it is really helpful. And then that turns into building habits where I'm actually taking action on it. And then I avoid the trap of kind of put the review away, and then 3 months later oh yeah, I forgot about that, right? And so it's just a way to build it kind of systems and processes so that it doesn't have to be about just discipline all the time, because that's going to not work as well for me.
Yeah, I love that. Greg, many people listening would have constructed their lives based on those external expectations that we mentioned before, and chasing that sort of hedonic treadmill of more stuff and looking better and having more, chasing that sort of external validation and expectation. How can people start to think about reconstructing their identity in a more healthier way for some of the things that you've been talking about already?
Yeah, I think part of that, Andrew, is just the journey of adult development and human development. We're all on this journey, and we're different. And so different people will have different priorities and values. But I think many of us, maybe most of us, end up realizing that a lot of the things that we were so focused on and so enamored with when we were younger start to fall away. As we get some years of experience under our belt and some failures and a bunch of messy middles and everything, we can kind of look at it more from a higher perspective and see some of those patterns. By the way, one of the traps in the traps test, and that's part of a new book that I'm working on, is a trap of materialism. And it's really kind of excessive materialism. I think the world that many of us live in today in the Western world is very focused on material things of accumulation and consumption. And there's nothing wrong with these. In fact, money is a tool that we need and that we can use. But if it pulls us away from our core and away from our values and away the time away from our families, because we're so focused on more money or pleasing the boss, and from our responsibilities and our health, again, I think we're going to end up regretting that, and the fact that we're underweighting some of the non-material things. You could talk about, it might be spiritual for you, it might be religious, or it might just be some personal things that have to do with emotions or relationships. Whatever it is for you, just having a good balance and kind of integrating your life and work across those areas that, again, will hold up, that will stand the test of time. And so not just playing that game because everybody's doing it, right? It's really easy because we're social and we're tribal and these kinds of things to just follow the crowd. And so there's a writer, Dershowitz, who talked about excellent sheep. He said that so many of us graduate from like a good university, and you're smart, you're ambitious, but you become a sheep. You're out there just following. You're just doing like what all the other sheep are doing. Like, why not be the lion? Why not be the shepherd? Why not blaze your own path in life? I think you'll be proud of yourself and you'll have more fun, even though there'll probably be a lot of volatility and ups and downs of failures as well as successes. But you'll own your life. And another example of the messy middle for me, Andrew, when I was working so hard at that scale up, I kind of handed over my life to them and my time. And eventually I took my life back. I took my life back. And it's one of the best things I ever did. And it's led to so many, fun, new, surprising adventures for me.
Yeah, lovely. I don't know if you know the Australian cartoonist Gary Larson.
Oh, yeah.
I think he's Australian, Gary Larson.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know where he's from. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's got that great cartoon of the sheep, and they're all sort of just on the hill, but there's one standing up with his hand up, sort of going, it doesn't have to be this way, It's a great cartoon that sort of summarises. And I think this is the beauty of one of the themes that has threaded through this conversation, Greg, around the messy middle is a place we can choose to put ourselves to work through to get to the other side of some of this, because making those choices, I think listeners to the podcast would know by now that we're not endorsing that that's just a simple step and an easy declaration and it's done. But putting yourself into that position takes courage, but there's a whole lot of benefit from working through that process that you're just talking about around taking that back for yourself in that example. I like in life design, you talk about sort of incremental improvement and radical change, that both are needed and possible. I'm just wondering if you could share when you think both are appropriate, and is there a downside for choosing the wrong one at the wrong time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think our point earlier was that sometimes we're so caught up in the big picture and wanting to have all the clarity that we become paralyzed. But the flip side is that sometimes if we're just focused on the bias towards action and the little things, the little p purpose, we can play too small. So there's a wonderful book by Tara Sophia Moore called Playing Big. And it's a book for women, but it applies very much to everybody. It's a beautiful book. And she says a lot of people, they play too small and they don't go for that big project, or they don't go for that dream or that startup. And again, that's you'll end up regretting that. And a lot of that goes back to the self-doubt that we talked about earlier, the limiting beliefs and the negative self-talk. And the point of my traps work, Andrew, is that the traps are the common traps of living that are like a broken record, and they're literally just playing and playing for years, for decades. And often we're not even aware of them, the self
Mm,
doubt and the negative self. It's just kind of something, it's subconscious in some cases, or it's so habitual that we don't even notice it anymore. And my point is, it's a broken record. It's just going to keep inhibiting your happiness or your quality of life, or inhibiting your leadership effectiveness or your performance, until you finally say, I'm in the trap, and you have the honesty to admit it, right? And you stop lying to yourself, which we're really good at.
mm.
And then you commit to taking action, and then you have some agency about that. You set an intention and you actually follow up on it. And we can also get caught up in trying to do too many traps at once. And so there's real value in focus.
Mm.
What's the theme of this quarter? Or what's the one thing that I want to do better? And then I can build on that, and I can get momentum, and I can spread, and I can get some synergy and some wins. But not playing big, I think, is another one of those things where, who knows, maybe you'll hit it, or maybe you'll learn so much along the way, and it'll lead to a new door opening of new opportunities and relationships. So, and that's hard, knowing when to take the incremental versus, I mean, I think there's just judgment and wisdom that come in there, and kind of trial and error, and learning through experience is a big part of it.
Yeah, I had a coach who once sort of said to me metaphorically that part of the wisdom of just living, not just leadership, was knowing when to sort of push the chips all in to make the commitment or make the choice or back the decision, and when it's just the incremental play, and knowing which is required. The decision when you go, I'm all in, relationship, for example. It's not, you're not placing a couple of small bets there. You're pushing all your chips into the table and saying, you and me are doing this together, and we're working at this, and I'm committed, and my whole hand is in. And versus some of those incremental, smaller, let me just see, I don't want to put all of my chips into this one piece of software that might not work. Let's do the minimum viable product approach. And I found it a nice metaphor in terms of just thinking about the decision I was making and which type of decision it was.
Yeah. It reminded me of something that we came to in our Life Entrepreneurs book, where we interviewed 55 people about their life and work and tell their stories. And so, one of the things, if you're going to be a life entrepreneur, an entrepreneur is a risk taker. That's part and parcel of entrepreneurship. And so there's a failure rate that's associated with that, right? And that's kind of, for some people, it was interesting. We interviewed all these people, and some people are actually by nature risk averse, and other people are kind of love risk, and they kind of risk junkies, and most of us are somewhere in between. But the life entrepreneurs were people who found something worth risking, where it was worth it to take some risks. And there was kind of an equation that kind of came out of this. One is that there's the cost of failure, and you have to be smart and level-headed. Like, what happens if I try it and I fail? And often we overweight the cost, and like we're way too negative, and we're going to be okay, we're going to survive, we're going to. And the second thing is the value of failure. right? It's like if you fail, that's probably when you're going to learn a lot. And that's certainly been, and often learning through a fire hose when things are challenging and you didn't do it right and whatnot. But the third thing is the cost of regret, of not playing big or not trying. And there's really good research on this from Dan Pink and Bronnie Ware in Australia. I know you've talked about her on the podcast before about regrets,
Mm.
the top regrets of the dying, those kind of regrets of omission where we didn't do something that we wanted to do. Those are often the most painful.
Yeah. And they're the most what we don't think about those ones much at all, do we? What would I regret if I didn't have a crack at this and it came off? It's a really nice reminder, Greg. On that, what are some of the specific fears that commonly stop people that you see in your experience and work with individuals and organisations, and what practices help to build that sort of courage in stepping into the fear a little bit more?
Mm. Yeah, so fear, it's a great question because fear, I think, is one of the mega traps that underlies a lot of the other traps.
Mm,
And so it's the fear of failure. It's the fear of judgment. It's the fear of looking bad. It's the fear of disappointing someone. It's the fear of making a mistake. It's the fear of embarrassment. So many people are afraid of public speaking in so many visceral ways because of, we're so groupish and we're so dependent on our status in the tribe and being part of it. I think, I wrote an article once on my website, getting good at overcoming fear. And there was a lot in there. But I think that's a master skill, Andrew, because I think fear is ultimately one of the core things that's holding us back, along with ego. And I think one of the big things with fear is reframing. Fear puts us in this state where we're in the kind of ancient part of our brain, and we're not using our creativity and our prefrontal frontal cortex and our cognitive capacities and whatnot. And we're in just kind of this state of adrenaline and stress and whatnot. But if we can reframe towards opportunity, towards learning, and we can switch out of that fixed mindset into a growth mindset, or from how we look into kind of how this could be leveraged. And I think the other reframe that's a really big part of it, it's kind of a mega reframe for all the stuff we're talking about, is reframing away from ourselves. We're so often we're just in our bubble. We're just thinking too much about, oh my God, what happens if and they think that about me, and if I, and it's like, well, focus on value, focus on your team at work, and how it might be good, and how you have trust, and focus on what you can learn and how you can serve others. And so just that changing that focus from the me to we and us and together. Again, it's that radical collaboration. I think that can just kind of flips our brain out of that fear mode into, oh, I'm kind of excited about maybe contributing, and it's going to feel really good if I can help that person out.
mm.
And they're probably going to be really grateful, and maybe it'll connect us. So flipping it out to an other focus and get out of our little ego bubble. Our friend Chuck Walkendorfer told us, my ego is not my amigo. And too often we're just way too much in our heads, and it's about me, me, me.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great book, and I'm paraphrasing here, probably connecting a little bit of Pippa's work into our conversation, but by Dr. Pippa Grange on fear, Fear Less, the book is called, and she talks about winning shallow or winning deep. And so this winning shallow is sort of winning through not a lot of risk, or winning by chasing the external reward and validation, versus winning deep, where it's deeply connected to purpose and deeply connected to what matters to you. And that, of course, involves risk, which involves fear and worry and all those things that we have to navigate. And it's a nice place that you're encouraging people to also see that the data is literally that data for us to feed back and step into, as opposed to devastation and we got it wrong and the world's going to end.
Yeah. I love what you just said, Andrew. And it reminds me that having an inner life, I think, is such an important part of this. And for all the reasons we talked about earlier, we often don't have much of an inner life. We're so busy, we're so doing all this stuff, and we're responding. But the extent to which we can get quiet and we can meditate or pray, or we can read, or we can just go for a walk and just be present with nature and the sun and the clouds, or see in the park, and then you end up doing what Parker Palmer talked about, which is listening to your life and letting your life speak, as opposed to being spoken into so much that you lose your life to give
Mm,
it away to others too much. And it's not about not being connected to others or not serving. It's about following that, being the sheep, the Gary Larson, the cartoon that you were talking about, and just living in accordance to something that won't hold up for you because it's your life.
yeah. What concepts or ideas have you revised about your work, or even maybe abandoned because your understanding's grown or broadened? I don't know about you, but earlier books I've written, you look back and they hurt a little bit because you think, wow, I don't know why I thought that was going to be the thing that was good or reasonable or the right path to advise people, because you get exposed. And so I look back on it with a bit of a cringe, but also with a bit of pride, because my thought has developed and changed.
Yeah, yeah. It's nice to be able to get to that second edition as we revise and learn and grow. Yeah. I just love to learn and grow. So I'm just a sponge. And so I guess one of the things would be that part of the framework of my and our thinking when we're doing some of this work early on was more along the lines of a strategic plan, right? It was kind of like a business plan. And there's value in those elements of kind of probing those things. But I've come to believe that it's much more of a fluid thing. And so, I was involved with startups and scale ups, and I taught entrepreneurship over in Sweden at master's level. And this whole debate of the business plan versus the business model and the business model canvas, and kind of the 40-page detailed document that's kind of rigid and locks you into kind of deliverables versus the one-page visual depiction of some of the main things that's much more flexible and agile and rapid fire. And I think there's value in both in different settings, but often in the messy middle or an early stage startup or in the chaos of life, that more life design and the canvassing and the kind of keeping it shorter and flexible will serve us well, as opposed to the business plan. And the ops plan is going to serve you better if you're in a big company that's been around 100 years and you're executing stuff and you're trying to tweak and get that 0.5% improvement and optimize this. Of course you want to have those detailed plans and these kinds of things, but in the messy middle of life we need that flexibility. And so it's much more of that iterative, flexible, agile process of life crafting and work design and career design.
Mm. As a way of wrapping up, Greg, is there a question that you think people should be? I mean, you've given so many suggestions already, so I'm going to the deeper depths of the well, perhaps. But is there a question when people are in the messy middle that you would recommend or wish they'd ask themselves a little bit more, and perhaps why you think that question is important or helpful?
Hmm. Wow, that's a beautiful question. The one that comes to mind is, what would happen if I trusted myself through the messy middle? What would happen if I just believed in my capacity, that I've got resources, that I've got some help out there, if I didn't do it alone, if I asked for help, if I trusted myself? And I think that would just help reframe you away from the kind of the fear mode and the concern, and back it takes you into the place of ego and how you're going to look into opportunity and adventure and fun and learning. So that's what comes to mind.
Awesome. Look, I knew this was going to be a great conversation, Greg. If I did my job, I knew you'd be terrific. So I've thoroughly enjoyed the time we've had together. And if you'd be so generous, I reckon there's a second episode somewhere down the track for us to get together again, because there's a bunch more questions I have. But thank you so much for your time and your patience in getting us to this point. And it's been awesome speaking with you. You've given a lot of great ideas and reflection points for people within a short period of time. Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and you bring a lot of value. I've been enjoying your podcast, and hopefully this is helpful to some people out there.
Two quick things before we wrap up. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to access the full list of show notes or explore some other episodes, simply visit andrewhorsfield.com. And please consider forwarding this episode to someone that you think would benefit. It will not only be appreciated by the person you choose, but help spread the word and amplify the impact I'm trying to make for the podcast. Thanks for listening.